So what's the point? Was it effective? Did it even work? I remember sitting across from Phil Neuenfeld. Some of us remember him, a giant of a man, not just in stature, but in intellect and passion and importance. One-time president of the Wisconsin AFL-CIO. I remember sitting with him one day, and we're having lunch, and we're talking about our lives and our work. And Phil mentions the protests that he helped lead and organize in Madison in 2011. This is like ancient history, right? So long ago. Yes, Act 10. All those protests against Act 10, that anti-labor, anti-union legislation. Now, if you remember, there were lots of people, speeches. Phil was there leading it all, in front of it all. And there was lots of pizza, too, evidently. But there I am with Phil, and I ask him, what good? What good did it do? Was Act 10 overturned? No, it actually wasn't. No. The protests didn't accomplish what I guess they had meant to do. Act 10 became the law of the land, well, at least in Wisconsin. So what was the point? The same could be said about our gospel, about the story, about the reason we're here with palms. Jesus and his protest march into Jerusalem. Because that's what it was. It wasn't some feel-good parade with smiling kids and balloons and bands, not like, the St. Patty's Day parade we just had. No, this was political from start to finish. Jesus enters Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, and my thing timed out. Just love the computer. All right, let's try this. Oh my goodness. He entered, okay, let me go there. Entered from the Mount of Olives, which was the place where, according to the prophet Zechariah, the king of that land would come. Here we go. Here we got it. We got it back. Phew. All right. He enters from Mount Olives, the Mount of Olives. For people of his day, that was the place where the rescuer was going to come from. The overthrow the Roman Empire, to rescue and save everyone from that oppression, which is, by the way, the word and the meaning of a Hosanna is save us. Save us. Hosanna is a prayer. It is a plea, cry. Now, the folks who were saying that, calling out, perhaps they remembered Zechariah and that word of God from the Hebrew Scriptures, which says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, lo, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. He will cut off the chariot from Ephraim, the war horse from Jerusalem. The battle bow shall be cut off. He shall command peace to the nations. His dominion shall be from sea to sea and the river to the ends of the earth." Sounds great, right? But Jesus, that didn't happen. And Jesus didn't look like all the other kings. He wasn't standing in a chariot or atop some strong battle steed. Picture our MPD police horses if you've seen those giant beasts. No, this was a colt, some animal that had never been ridden, a baby donkey. But still, the people hoped. They shouted. They waved those branches. They laid down their cloaks because they wanted They wanted a king. They wanted Jesus to be their king. Of course, they already had a king, right? A puppet of Caesar locally, and who would not tolerate competitors for the throne. There was a king already, the emperor. And instead of Jesus kicking out the Romans, they kicked out and kicked him. Kicked Jesus, beat him, crucified him, and ended up in a few days later hanging a sign on his head. That's all right. That's all right. Vicki, I can sit anywhere. Go ahead. Go ahead, have a seat. Have a seat. It's okay. I can sit anywhere. I have. Thank you, Vicki. Yeah. So instead of Jesus riding in and everyone acclaiming him and then landing himself at the palace, no. In a few days, we know the story, most of us, right? We know he gets kicked and beaten and executed. So I think it's fair to say that Jesus' little protest march into Jerusalem was only effective in execution, his own. And that's the thing about protests. They actually are not all that effective. And that's not just my innate cynicism talking. Remember a few months ago when we held our Drag Me to Church event here at church, right? And you know, those who were there, remember that? Do you remember those protesters outside? Did that change our opinions on what we were doing? No, It did not matter how many people who would have been out there. We were still going to have our event. How did those protesters make you feel? Pardon? Icky. You felt icky. Some of us, there was some fear, because there were protesters, yeah. Icky.
Also more cohesion among us.
More cohesion among us, yes. There were some very fired up people. I'm thinking of Jan. It doesn't take a lot to fire her up, but she was fired up, and she was saying all sorts of not terrible things, per se. But, people, we were fired up about that, about what we were doing. Protests do that. They energize. But they are an ineffective way to change anyone's mind. And this has been shown from study after study, from interview after interview. Even if you use a very extreme form of protest or violence, and actually it really backfires. Most people, the more extreme a protest gets, more people then will support the other side. And this is what ended up happening with some protests about Trump way back when. The more violent, more extreme, or demonstrative they became, it actually pushed people to support Trump even more. So if protests don't actually sway public opinion or actually cause social change, they don't change people's mind, they don't change the people being protested, what do? They don't change. Remember that Women's March? That, again, way back when. Wonderful thing. But do you think it changed Trump's attitude about women? One bit? No, it didn't. But what they do, from Jesus' day to others to now, is invigorate the participants, the protesters themselves, the believers, enabling them to hopefully do the real work that creates change. And that was Phil's answer to my question, what good were all those protests in Madison? He admitted, it didn't work. It didn't change the legislator's mind. It wasn't going to. But it invigorated the supporters. It invigorated. So if protests don't actually sway, they do change, they do encourage and invigorate the folks to do the real work, of change, to do the educating, the strategic legislation, the conversations, the lives seeped in the values of the change that is espoused. And that's according to Duncan Green. He's an activist and author of How Change Happens. What protests do, they invigorate us to live and change. Did you really need me to tell you that? Did you really need me to tell you that? I see a little bit, well, you're the pastor, so we should like to listen to what you have to say, and, you occasionally come with some information. But we shouldn't need anyone to tell us that. Because while we know that Jesus didn't save the Judeans from the Romans, and that within a week or so, which is what we're celebrating, observing, Jesus would be crucified, executed for his subversiveness, I ask, how many of us even remember the name of the emperor of Rome at that time? Do you know that guy's name? All right, thinking. It was, yes, Caesar would be in one of the, it was Tiberius. Tiberius, yes. Caesar was a title. He was Emperor Tiberius Caesar Augustus. He threw all of that in there, got all those names. So only a few folks would kind of remember it, maybe some history geeks, nerds, like my son and I, and others. The point being, it's 2,000 years later, and we are here holding palms, shouting or saying or singing, Hosanna, because of Jesus. And that's happening all around this planet. Not because simply Jesus paraded into Jerusalem, but because people remembered. People know what it is to cry out, save us. And we know that that doesn't happen through military might. It isn't happening through curtailing others' rights. We know salvation doesn't come from isolation and hate, but rather through love. And dare I say, sacrificial love. The love that doesn't always put us first, but choosing to follow Jesus in the way of each and every day, not parading our power, but through caring, sharing, and daring to love each and every day. And that has what has brought us these 2,000 years later to sit in a room together, say those words, sing these words, and still have hope and faith in God. Long before that emperor's turned to dust, long after that emperor's turned to dust, we're still here. Amen. Amen.